In the beginning, the world appeared as a complex mesh of forces, each exerting pressure on the other, and human beings were born into this intricate network without full understanding. For the Sumerians, life was never perceived as a linear progression from birth to death, but as a series of interrelated layers where the divine, natural, and human elements intersected. The first encounters with these forces were recorded on clay tablets, which became the primary medium for capturing both the tangible and intangible aspects of existence. The Anunnaki, powerful beings who had come from afar, were central to these narratives. The Sumerians recorded their interactions with them not as myths, but as practical accounts of knowledge, rituals, and events that shaped the structure of society. The Anunnaki taught the Sumerians skills and wisdom that went beyond ordinary human experience: timekeeping, laws, the principles of kingship, and advanced forms of observation. Yet, even in these records, there are hints that much remained unspoken, as if some knowledge was deliberately left incomplete. Each tablet, carefully etched with wedge-shaped signs, carried more than words. It carried intention, purpose, and a deliberate alignment with cosmic order. The act of writing itself was sacred. A single misplaced mark could disrupt the intended balance, creating subtle but potentially profound consequences. Writing was not merely a tool for communication, it was a method of sustaining reality itself. The early Sumerians saw themselves as participants in a living network, where every act, every uttered word, and every movement could ripple through multiple layers of existence. They believed that human actions could either harmonize with the cosmic order or introduce instability. Hence, laws and rituals were not imposed arbitrarily. They were methods of maintaining equilibrium, of reinforcing the boundaries that held the world together. Within this framework, the role of kings and priests was deeply intertwined with divine authority, but also with immense responsibility. Kings were not simply rulers, they were stewards of cosmic order, intermediaries between the mortal and the divine. Priests served as mediators, interpreters, and guardians of knowledge, ensuring that the rituals aligned with the patterns recorded in the sacred tablets. Their work required precision, attentiveness, and a profound understanding of the hidden mechanisms of the universe. Moreover, Sumerians understood that knowledge could be dangerous if misused. The power of writing, the power to name, to inscribe, to record, all of it carried the weight of responsibility. Certain truths were kept deliberately veiled, encoded in layers of symbolism, or only partially revealed, so that only those trained in the sacred arts could navigate them safely. The Anunnaki themselves were perceived as bound by this order. They could teach, guide, and intervene, but they too operated within the constraints of an overarching system that neither fully revealed nor fully concealed itself. The Sumerians' relationship with the divine was thus neither purely worshipful nor entirely servile. It was interactive and cautious, informed by respect for boundaries and the consequences of overstepping them. In every ritual, offering, and recorded observation, there is a recognition of fragility, that reality itself could unravel if approached carelessly. The foundational insight of this early civilization was that the world was a system of correspondences. Every element reflected and influenced another, the movement of stars mirrored the cycles of rivers, the decisions of kings echoed in the patterns of trade and harvest, and the proper performance of rituals ensured the continued favor of the Anunnaki, not out of arbitrary kindness, but because order demanded it. In these first records, one can already perceive a central tension. Humans were powerful in their capacity to maintain or disrupt balance, yet profoundly limited in their ability to comprehend the totality of forces surrounding them. The tablets do not just tell stories, they instruct, warn, and remind. They are both archive and safeguard, ensuring that the lessons of contact with the Anunnaki, and the fragility of order, are preserved for generations. Through this lens, early Sumerian history is revealed not as a sequence of events, but as a living tapestry of guidance, observation, and subtle interaction with forces far beyond ordinary perception. Each tablet, each name, each ritual represents a node in a vast network, a network in which humans, gods, and cosmic patterns are intertwined. To read these tablets is not merely to study history, it is to trace the delicate structures that once maintained a fragile equilibrium, and to glimpse the awareness that humans held of their place within it. Even at this earliest stage, one senses that the Sumerians were acutely aware of limits of knowledge, limits of power, limits of the capacity to act without consequence. Their civilization is remarkable not only for its innovations, but for its conscious engagement with these limits, codified in writing, ritual, and daily practice. It is this careful, measured attention to the boundaries of human and divine action that distinguishes their records from mere legend, marking them as a civilization deeply attuned to the fragile interconnections of existence. Part 2. With the passage of time, the Sumerians' perception of history and memory shifted. Memory was not linear, it was a field in which past, present, and potential coexisted simultaneously. This is why their texts often seem fragmented or illogical to the modern reader. They did not aim merely to tell a story, they sought to activate memory. A Sumerian scribe did not simply record words. He entered a special state of attention in which the text became an extension of cosmic order. A single error in a sign was not an orthographic mistake, but an ontological one. A misplaced wedge could distort meaning and, in doing so, disrupt reality itself. For this reason, learning to write took many years and was accessible to only a few. Interestingly, many tablets were not intended to be read aloud. They were stored in temples, in sealed rooms, sometimes even embedded within walls. Their function was not to convey information to humans, but to ensure the presence of the text in a specific location. The text acted as an anchor, holding the shape of the world in place. Some tablets contained lists of names without explanation. These were not ordinary deities or kings. They stood apart, sometimes without grammatical connections, as if representing remnants of an older, more profound knowledge. The Sumerians did not explain their meaning but carefully preserved them. Over time, these names recurred across cities and contexts, always with a sense of distance. They were neither worshipped nor erased. It seems that the Sumerians understood that some things could neither be forgotten nor approached too closely. Nippur held a special place in this worldview. It was not a political capital, yet it was regarded as the axis of the world. Here were stored texts unconnected to any ruler or era. Nippur was perceived as the point where heavenly order touched the earth directly. The priests of Nippur neither ruled nor waged war. Their authority was different. They ensured the accuracy of rituals, the correctness of the calendar, and the preservation of names, dates, and sequences. An error in Nippur was considered more dangerous than a defeat in battle. The calendar itself was a sacred instrument. Time did not flow freely. It was divided into permissible segments, each with its own quality. Some days were unsuitable for decision-making. Other days rendered words especially potent. Certain periods made the boundaries between worlds thinner. It was during these periods that the most secretive rituals were performed. Little remains about them, but indirect evidence suggests that they were not requests but confirmations of distance. Humans reminded the gods, and themselves, where the boundary lay. Interestingly, later Sumerian texts introduce a disquieting motif: the gods become less accessible. Signs are harder to interpret, dreams more obscure, prophecies contradictory. This is not punishment but a gradual withdrawal. Cities continue to build temples, priests continue their service, yet the sense of direct presence slowly fades. The Sumerians note this state without embellishment. Their texts begin to carry a nostalgia for the former clarity, for the time when signs were more comprehensible. There is no mention of sudden catastrophe. Everything occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly. Connection does not break, it thins. This creates a particular type of anxiety, not fear of wrath, but fear of silence. Silence itself becomes the most frightening theme in late Sumerian tradition. If the gods do not answer, either order is disrupted or the conditions of existence have changed. To acknowledge the latter is to recognize that the world is no longer as it was. Therefore, the Sumerians act as if order can still be maintained. They rewrite texts, restore rituals, return to ancient formulas. Their actions appear as an attempt to retain the departing presence through precision and repetition. Yet beneath this precision lies the deep fatigue of a culture that has long lived at the border between knowledge and prohibition. The Sumerians feel that something essential is slipping away, but they do not know how to name it without destroying the remnants of equilibrium. Thus, their texts develop a strange combination of discipline and grief. The world still exists, but it no longer possesses the density of meaning it once had. It is this state, not destruction, but emptiness, that becomes the defining experience of the era. Part 3. As the centuries advanced, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki and the fading clarity of signs led the Sumerians to reconceptualize their role in the cosmos. They were no longer simply participants in a dialogue with divine beings. They became custodians of order, responsible for sustaining the structures left behind. This responsibility was immense because the continuity of the world was now perceived as dependent upon human diligence rather than divine oversight. Priests and scribes became the central figures in this new arrangement. Their work was no longer just ceremonial, it was existential. Every tablet copied, every ritual performed, every observation of the heavens served as a stabilizing act, preserving fragments of a reality that might otherwise dissolve. Knowledge became codified not to empower but to contain, to prevent chaos from spilling through gaps left by retreating divinity. The Sumerians' perception of time also changed. Linear chronology remained for practical purposes, but conceptually, time became layered and contingent. Past events were not only records but active stabilizers. Repetition of sacred sequences was essential, not as remembrance, but as reinforcement. Every repetition maintained resonance with the primordial order, ensuring the faint remaining presence of the Anunnaki and the patterns they had established. Architecture reflected this philosophy. Temples, walls, canals, and cities were not only practical constructs but repositories of order. Every brick, every canal's curve, every central courtyard corresponded to symbolic meanings and cosmic patterns. Building was an act of preservation, a physical reinforcement of the laws of existence. A misalignment could be catastrophic, not physically, but metaphysically, potentially disturbing the delicate balance that sustained the world. In this period, the distinction between visible and invisible forces became central. Human perception was limited, yet humans had to act in a space saturated with unseen influences. Rituals, inscriptions, amulets, and sacred symbols functioned as interfaces between what could be controlled and what remained enigmatic. They served as buffers, translating cosmic order into actionable forms without direct exposure to the full power behind them. The Sumerians also began to codify uncertainty itself. Tablets contained deliberate ambiguities, fragmented sequences, and encoded symbols whose meaning could only be partially grasped. This was a conscious strategy. Too much clarity might overwhelm the human recipient and destabilize the fragile structures of reality. Uncertainty became a protective device, a mechanism by which knowledge could endure without endangering the equilibrium it sought to maintain. Dreams, once conduits of divine guidance, became increasingly cryptic. The visions granted in sleep no longer offered direct instruction but images and impressions, suggesting patterns without guaranteeing comprehension. Priests specialized in interpreting these fragments, translating them into cautious actions rather than commands. A single misinterpretation could ripple outward, undermining rituals or destabilizing administrative sequences. Political life adapted to these changes. Kingship was no longer simply a channel of divine will, it became a practical office of maintenance. The king ensured the flow of goods, the fairness of trade, the preservation of city walls, and the correct observance of ritual sequences. Their symbolic connection to the Anunnaki remained, but functionally, their authority was rooted in their ability to sustain order, not in receiving divine favor directly. Every social contract, every legal decree, every economic transaction was imbued with the awareness that human action now bore full responsibility for stability. Laws were detailed, redundant, and precise, designed to compensate for the diminished oversight of the gods. The meticulous attention to detail in commerce, agriculture, and governance is a testament to this shift. Amidst all this, the Sumerians did not experience despair. Their understanding of the world had matured into a form of pragmatic reverence. They accepted that the gods' direct guidance might no longer be accessible, yet the framework of order, the laws, rituals, texts, and structures, could be preserved through human diligence. Acting within this framework became the highest expression of wisdom and devotion. Thus, the late Sumerian era was defined by careful stewardship, a world in which human beings operated as intermediaries and custodians, preserving both the visible and invisible order. The civilization did not collapse suddenly. It evolved into a form of existence that emphasized attention, precision, and the maintenance of a fading cosmic balance, ensuring that the world would endure, even as the voices of the Anunnaki grew ever more distant. Part 4. As the centuries unfolded, Sumerian culture increasingly embraced the principle that stability was paramount, and that every human action had to be measured against the potential to disrupt or preserve order. The once clear guidance of the Anunnaki had receded into distant memory, leaving behind only signs, patterns, and traces that could be interpreted cautiously. This created a world in which precision replaced spontaneity, and repetition became sacred. Education, particularly the training of scribes, reached new levels of rigor. Learning to write was no longer simply a matter of literacy. It was a discipline of cosmic maintenance. Each sign, each wedge, each line had a prescribed place, and mistakes could have consequences not only for the individual but for the balance of the city and the rituals that connected it to the heavens. Scribes became the guardians of both memory and stability, working meticulously to prevent the erosion of accumulated knowledge. Temples evolved to reflect this philosophy. Their architecture emphasized containment and hierarchy, limiting access to sacred spaces while reinforcing the symbolic order. Inner chambers were designed to concentrate ritual energy, while outer courtyards controlled the movement of people. Every physical element, the alignment of walls, the placement of altars, the curvature of canals, mirrored cosmic patterns. Construction itself was an act of preservation, reinforcing the invisible structures that sustained life and civilization. Rituals, too, became more formalized and exacting. They were no longer mere celebrations or offerings to gain favor. They were acts of careful repetition, intended to maintain continuity in a world where direct divine intervention was no longer assured. Every step, every chant, every sacrifice was observed for adherence to precise formulae, ensuring that human activity did not disrupt the delicate equilibrium of existence. Over time, the Sumerians developed a complex understanding of risk and uncertainty. They recognized that knowledge could be dangerous if fully revealed, and that direct access to divine will could destabilize the carefully maintained order. Therefore, they employed strategies of selective concealment. Fragments of wisdom, cryptic symbols, and coded texts were distributed among initiates, while the broader populace maintained general routines and rituals. Knowledge was compartmentalized to safeguard reality itself. Astronomy played a vital role in this system. Observations of stars, planets, and celestial cycles were no longer only for predicting seasons or agricultural needs. They were part of a cosmic calibration system, a way to align earthly actions with patterns perceived as stable and enduring. Celestial bodies became markers of continuity, reminding humans that although direct guidance from the Anunnaki was waning, the universe still exhibited order that could be followed. Political authority adapted to these changes. Kingship was increasingly defined by the ability to maintain and enforce order, rather than by charisma or divine favor. The king's responsibilities extended to the precise administration of resources, the enforcement of laws, and the supervision of rituals. Authority became practical, functional, and anchored in the continuity of structures, rather than in personal connection to the divine. Social structures reflected the same ethos. Contracts, trade agreements, and civic duties were meticulously documented, creating a network of interdependent actions that stabilized community life. Law codes became dense and precise, emphasizing prevention of disruption over adjudication of wrongdoing. The careful adherence to these systems allowed cities to thrive even as the direct presence of divine forces diminished. Yet, despite this focus on preservation and stability, the Sumerians did not lose their sense of the sacred. Their culture acknowledged limits, embraced restraint, and maintained reverence for the unknown. Wisdom was measured not by knowledge alone, but by the ability to act correctly within constraints, respecting the boundaries of both seen and unseen forces. This phase of Sumerian civilization demonstrates a profound maturity, The realization that the world could endure not because the Anunnaki remained physically present, but because humans, through attention, precision, and discipline, could sustain the forms and structures that gave it coherence. The civilization's legacy lies in this careful stewardship, a testament to the enduring power of meticulous, conscious engagement with a fragile reality. Part 5. As centuries passed, the Sumerians' awareness of their own responsibility deepened, giving rise to a civilization defined less by divine intervention than by human diligence. Every act, whether mundane or ceremonial, was charged with significance. Life itself became an exercise in maintaining balance, a subtle but constant negotiation between the seen and unseen, the known and the deliberately obscured. The scribes' role grew ever more central. They were not only recorders but custodians of existence, ensuring that every tablet, every inscription, every notation preserved the precise order necessary to maintain cosmic equilibrium. Repetition became a sacred duty. The act of copying texts with scrupulous accuracy was itself a ritual, a protective measure to prevent the erosion of knowledge that could threaten stability. Temples evolved into repositories of memory and stability. Their inner sanctuaries were increasingly restricted, accessible only to those initiated into the full understanding of rituals. Courtyards and public spaces became transitional zones, where observation, preparation, and participation were controlled and measured. Even architecture functioned symbolically: walls, corridors, and altars aligned with cosmic principles, transforming the built environment into a living reinforcement of order. Rituals themselves reached new levels of precision. Every step, every chant, every offering was standardized, minimizing the risk of error. The intent was no longer to appeal for divine favor but to safeguard the structure of reality. In these ceremonies, humans enacted a complex choreography that mirrored celestial patterns and echoed the structures encoded in tablets. Deviations were seen not merely as mistakes, but as disruptions that could ripple through the fabric of existence. The Sumerians became adept at managing uncertainty. Knowledge was compartmentalized, intentionally fragmented, and encoded. Some tablets offered only partial instructions or symbolic representations that required interpretation. This method ensured that wisdom could persist without overwhelming those who possessed it or destabilizing the larger system. In a sense, secrecy became a stabilizing force, and ambiguity a form of protection. Observation of the heavens played a critical role in this maintenance of order. Celestial bodies, their cycles and alignments, were meticulously recorded, forming a cosmic framework for guiding earthly activity. Stars, planets, and lunar cycles became benchmarks of stability, offering patterns that could be relied upon in a world where divine responsiveness was diminishing. Astronomical knowledge was integrated into every aspect of ritual and administration, linking the temporal with the eternal. Political power adapted to these realities. Kingship shifted from a source of divine command to a role defined by the practical enforcement of order. A king's authority derived from his ability to oversee resource distribution, enforce law codes, and supervise rituals, rather than from direct interaction with deities. Governance became procedural, emphasizing consistency, predictability, and preservation over charisma or favor. Social structures, too, were refined to preserve stability. Detailed legal codes, trade agreements, and civic regulations created a network of interdependent activities, ensuring that human society itself maintained balance. Every contract, every record of debt or exchange, reinforced the framework of order that supported civilization. Deviations were noted and corrected, but the emphasis remained on continuity rather than retribution. At the same time, the Sumerians cultivated a profound understanding of limits. They recognized the dangers of overreach, the hazards of unrestrained curiosity or ambition. Wisdom was measured not by accumulation of knowledge, but by discipline, restraint, and alignment with established patterns. The culture valued precision, patience, and adherence to principle, understanding that stability depended on these qualities as much as on any divine guidance. Through this period, the Sumerian civilization matured into a society defined by conscious maintenance of order, where human effort and attention substituted for the increasingly distant presence of the Anunnaki. Their legacy demonstrates that survival and continuity can depend not on power or intervention, but on meticulous stewardship, the disciplined preservation of form, and the careful alignment of human action with the enduring patterns of existence. Part 6. By this stage, the Sumerians had fully internalized the principle that existence itself was fragile and required constant care. Their perception of the world had shifted from direct interaction with deities to the maintenance of a framework left by the Anunnaki. Life was no longer defined solely by daily survival or conquest, but by sustaining the patterns, rituals, and inscriptions that ensured the cosmos remained coherent. The scribe's role became almost priestly in nature. Their task was not simply to write but to anchor reality through precision. Each tablet copied, each sign carved with care, was a deliberate act of stabilization. Mistakes were seen as potential fractures in the fabric of existence. Repetition and verification were forms of cosmic stewardship. Knowledge had become a tool of containment, not merely a resource for understanding. Temples reflected this philosophy. Inner sanctuaries became more restricted, accessible only to those trained in the subtleties of ritual precision. Courtyards, altars, and canals were carefully designed to mirror celestial structures, transforming physical spaces into repositories of cosmic order. Architecture itself became a language of stability, each alignment reinforcing the balance between earth and sky. Rituals reached new heights of formality and exactitude. They were no longer appeals for divine favor but acts of structural maintenance. Every movement, every chant, every offering was calibrated to ensure that the energies of the world remained in harmony. Deviations were considered dangerous, capable of creating instability far beyond immediate perception. The Sumerians also developed sophisticated methods of encoding and fragmenting knowledge. Certain texts were intentionally incomplete, symbolic, or cryptic. This was not accidental. Too much clarity could destabilize understanding or disrupt established patterns. Ambiguity and secrecy became essential strategies for preserving the integrity of knowledge. And the order of the world. Astronomy continued to play a central role. Celestial observations provided a stable framework, a map by which humans could align their actions with enduring cosmic rhythms. The movement of stars and planets was meticulously recorded, not only for practical purposes like agriculture but as a guideline for ritual and societal timing, ensuring that human activities synchronized with the cosmos. Political authority transformed accordingly. Kingship was now primarily a matter of administrative oversight and ritual supervision. The king's legitimacy derived less from divine charisma and more from his ability to maintain stability across cities, trade networks, and religious practices. Governance was procedural, predictable, and anchored in the careful enforcement of law and ritual observance. Social structures adapted to reinforce this delicate balance. Legal codes, contracts, trade regulations, and civic protocols were carefully detailed, creating interconnected networks of responsibility. Each individual action, no matter how small, had the potential to influence larger structures. The focus was on continuity, predictability, and measured intervention, rather than sudden correction or punishment. Throughout all of this, the Sumerians cultivated a profound understanding of restraint. Wisdom was no longer about acquiring knowledge for its own sake but about acting within the limits of stability, respecting the boundaries set by both natural and divine forces. Precision, patience, and alignment with established norms became the highest virtues. Ultimately, the Sumerian civilization demonstrates the profound power of conscious stewardship. As direct contact with the Anunnaki receded, humans assumed responsibility for preserving the structures, patterns, and rituals that maintained the cosmos. Their enduring legacy is not merely in their innovations or mythology, but in the meticulous care with which they sustain balance, showing that civilization can persist through discipline, attention, and the conscious maintenance of order even in the absence of divine intervention. Part 7. As the Sumerian civilization progressed, the perception of memory, history, and cosmic responsibility deepened into an almost philosophical awareness. Humans were no longer merely actors under divine instruction. They were custodians of continuity, entrusted with maintaining structures that were themselves older than any one generation. The Anunnaki had withdrawn from direct engagement, leaving a framework that demanded careful attention and disciplined action. Education became the foundation of survival. Learning to write, read, and interpret symbols was not just about communication, it was about perpetuating stability. Scribes were trained to detect subtle errors that might threaten order, to interpret cryptic symbols, and to ensure that rituals and administrative acts were performed correctly. Every tablet, every line, every wedge-shaped mark carried significance far beyond its apparent meaning, a responsibility not lightly undertaken. Architecture evolved to embody cosmic order. Temples, canals, city walls, and courtyards were constructed to reflect patterns observed in the heavens, forming a physical manifestation of balance. Even minor deviations in construction could disrupt the delicate resonance between terrestrial and celestial structures. Building became a sacred act, a form of spatial stabilization, ensuring that the structures of the world remained coherent. Rituals became the lifeblood of Sumerian culture. They were no longer celebrations or petitions but methods of maintaining equilibrium. Repetition, accuracy, and timing were paramount. Every chant, gesture, and offering was executed with precision, reinforcing cosmic patterns and mitigating the risks posed by divine absence. Ritual was not about desire or favor but responsibility and preservation. Uncertainty was carefully managed. Some knowledge was intentionally fragmented or encoded, so that only trained initiates could interpret it safely. This controlled ambiguity protected both the knowledge itself and the larger structures that relied upon it. Secrets were not hoarded for power but preserved as a safeguard against misalignment, instability, or misinterpretation. Astronomical observation remained central. The Sumerians meticulously tracked stars, planets, and lunar cycles, establishing a temporal framework that guided both practical activities and ritual timing. Celestial bodies became touchstones of permanence in an era where divine presence was increasingly distant. By aligning human action with cosmic patterns, stability could be preserved despite the thinning influence of the Anunnaki. Political systems adapted accordingly. Kingship was framed not as divine entitlement but as a practical office of stewardship. A king's authority depended on his ability to manage resources, enforce laws, and supervise rituals. Governance became procedural, consistent, and anchored in human diligence, compensating for the gods' indirect involvement. Social systems were designed to reinforce stability. Legal codes, trade agreements, and civic responsibilities were meticulously recorded, creating interconnected networks that ensured continuity. Individual actions mattered not just locally but in the broader web of society, emphasizing collective responsibility and careful adherence to norms. Despite these formalizations, reverence remained. Sumerians understood limits of knowledge, power, and action. Wisdom was measured by the ability to act within these constraints, respecting the boundaries of both visible and invisible forces. This principle informed every decision, from daily administration to the performance of sacred rites. By this stage, Sumerian civilization had matured into a society deeply aware of its role as a custodian of continuity, balancing precision, restraint, and reverence. Even without direct divine intervention, humans could maintain the stability of the world. Their enduring legacy is evident not only in tablets, temples, and canals but in a culture defined by meticulous stewardship, a civilization that sustained balance through human discipline and careful attention to the fragile structures of existence. Part 8. As Sumerian society approached its later stages, the emphasis on preservation and stability intensified, evolving into a civilization of meticulous guardianship. With the Anunnaki increasingly absent, humans assumed full responsibility for sustaining the delicate structures that governed both earthly and cosmic order. Every action, no matter how trivial, became imbued with significance, as even small errors could ripple outward, threatening the continuity of cities, temples, and rituals. The role of scribes reached its pinnacle. They were no longer mere recorders of events or practitioners of writing, they were anchors of reality, ensuring that every tablet and inscription maintained the integrity of accumulated knowledge. Copying texts became a sacred duty, a repetitive act that reinforced patterns of cosmic and social stability. Each tablet was a microcosm of order, its precision a shield against chaos. Temples continued to reflect this philosophy, embodying cosmic principles in their architecture. Inner sanctuaries were increasingly restricted, available only to the initiated. Courtyards, altars, and canals were meticulously arranged to mirror celestial alignments, transforming the built environment into a repository of divine and human order. Physical construction itself became an act of stabilization, a tangible reinforcement of the invisible structures that sustained the world. Rituals, too, reached unprecedented levels of formalization. They were not performed to appeal to deities but to maintain the patterns that ensured continuity. Every gesture, chant, and offering was executed with precision, serving as a protective mechanism that aligned human activity with the order encoded in tablets and observed in the heavens. Deviations were seen as dangerous, capable of creating instability far beyond the immediate sphere of action. Knowledge management evolved into a sophisticated system of selective concealment. Some texts were intentionally fragmentary or symbolic, designed to be interpreted only by trained initiates. This strategy ensured that critical wisdom could survive without endangering the broader order. Ambiguity and secrecy became tools of preservation, protecting both knowledge and the structural stability upon which it depended. Astronomical observation remained central to the Sumerian worldview. The movements of stars, planets, and lunar cycles were meticulously tracked, providing a temporal and ritual framework that guided human activity. Celestial patterns acted as enduring constants in a world where divine presence was increasingly attenuated, allowing humans to align their actions with stable cosmic rhythms. Political authority shifted in tandem. Kingship was understood as a functional stewardship rather than a channel for divine mandate. Kings derived legitimacy from their ability to maintain resources, enforce law, and oversee ritual observance. Governance became procedural, predictable, and dependent on careful human diligence, compensating for the absence of direct divine oversight. Social structures mirrored these principles. Legal codes, contracts, trade regulations, and civic protocols were highly detailed, creating interconnected networks of responsibility. Individual actions had systemic consequences, reinforcing the importance of careful adherence to norms and continuity of practice. Stability depended on human vigilance as much as on cosmic order. Throughout all of this, the Sumerians cultivated a profound sense of restraint and awareness of limits. Wisdom was measured not by accumulation of knowledge, but by the capacity to act correctly within established structures. Restraint, precision, and adherence to ritual and administrative protocols became the highest expressions of intelligence and devotion. In the final centuries, Sumerian civilization had transformed into a society defined by conscious custodianship. Humans maintained the delicate frameworks left by the Anunnaki, preserving both memory and structure. Their legacy endures not in monuments alone, but in the meticulous attention to form, process, and continuity, a civilization that exemplified the power of careful stewardship in sustaining the world, even in the absence of divine presence. Part 9. By this stage, Sumerian civilization had fully embraced its role as guardian of continuity, with human diligence taking precedence over direct divine guidance. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki had transformed culture, governance, and daily life into a system focused on maintenance, precision, and stability. Every tablet, ritual, and architectural element was a deliberate act to preserve the framework of existence. Scribes were central to this process. Their work was no longer simply documentation, it was active preservation. Each sign inscribed in clay served as a stabilizing force, reinforcing cosmic and societal order. The act of copying texts, checking for errors, and observing proper sequences became a form of devotion, a ritualized responsibility to sustain the world's structure. Knowledge itself had become a tool of containment, its power harnessed not for expansion but for protection. Temples and sacred spaces reflected this philosophy in their design. Inner sanctuaries were carefully restricted, accessible only to initiates trained in ritual precision. Public spaces and courtyards were structured to channel activity according to cosmic patterns, ensuring that human interaction reinforced stability rather than chaos. Architecture became both symbolic and functional, translating abstract cosmic order into tangible, actionable form. Rituals evolved into complex systems of pattern reinforcement. No longer performed to curry favor, they were executed to maintain resonance between human actions and cosmic order. Precision in gestures, chants, and offerings was paramount, as deviations could have metaphysical consequences. Repetition became sacred, a mechanism to continuously recalibrate the world's fragile equilibrium. The management of knowledge grew increasingly sophisticated. Some texts were deliberately fragmentary, symbolic, or encoded. This strategy ensured that critical wisdom survived without destabilizing society. Secrecy and controlled ambiguity became protective mechanisms, safeguarding the structure of both knowledge and existence. Initiates interpreted these fragments with care, preserving continuity while avoiding direct exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. Astronomy remained a crucial pillar of Sumerian culture. Celestial observations provided temporal and ritual calibration, guiding both practical and ceremonial actions. The movements of stars, planets, and lunar cycles were treated as stable reference points, aligning human endeavors with enduring cosmic patterns even as direct guidance from the Anunnaki faded. Political authority adapted to these realities. Kingship became a function of stewardship rather than divine charisma. A king's legitimacy depended on his ability to oversee resources, enforce laws, and supervise rituals. Governance became procedural, predictable, and reliant on human diligence, compensating for the gods' indirect involvement. Social structures were carefully interconnected. Legal codes, contracts, trade agreements, and civic regulations formed a network of mutual responsibility, ensuring that individual actions reinforced the stability of the whole. Collective adherence to norms and precision in execution became essential, creating a culture in which human activity maintained balance in both society and the cosmos. In this late period, the Sumerians understood that wisdom was not simply knowledge, but the capacity to act within limits. Discipline, attention to detail, and restraint were prized above creativity or ambition. Civilization was sustained not through power or conquest but through careful observance, repetition, and maintenance of patterns, demonstrating that order depends on conscientious human action. Thus, Sumerian culture culminated as a civilization of meticulous stewardship. Even in the absence of direct divine oversight, humans preserved the intricate structures of ritual, law, and celestial observation. Their enduring legacy is a testament to the profound capacity of a society to sustain itself through precision, discipline, and conscious attention to the delicate balance between knowledge, action, and the invisible forces that govern existence. Part 10. In the final stage of Sumerian civilization, the legacy of the Anunnaki was no longer experienced as direct guidance but as patterns, texts, and structures that humans were tasked to preserve. Civilization had matured into a system in which continuity depended almost entirely on human vigilance, discipline, and careful maintenance of established forms. Scribes held the most critical role, as they ensured that knowledge remained coherent and precise. Each tablet, each line, each wedge-shaped mark became a protective anchor, stabilizing both earthly and cosmic order. Copying text was a ritualized responsibility, and even small errors were perceived as potential disturbances in the fragile equilibrium of existence. Knowledge had become a tool for sustaining reality, not merely for understanding it. Temples, cities, and infrastructure reflected the same principle. Sacred spaces were meticulously designed to align with celestial patterns, with restricted inner sanctuaries and carefully controlled public areas. Architecture itself functioned as a physical manifestation of order, reinforcing the stability of social and cosmic structures. Canals, courtyards, walls, and altars were not only practical but symbolic, forming a tangible interface between humans and the cosmic patterns they sought to preserve. Rituals became increasingly precise and codified. Every movement, chant, and offering was designed to maintain resonance between humans and the frameworks left by the Anunnaki. The repetition of ritual sequences ensured that patterns of order remained intact, even as the direct presence of divine beings receded. Ritual was no longer about favor or power, it was about safeguarding stability. Knowledge was carefully managed. Some texts were deliberately incomplete or cryptic, requiring interpretation by trained initiates. Ambiguity and secrecy became strategies of preservation, protecting both knowledge and the structural integrity of society. Human action had to align with these frameworks, ensuring continuity without overstepping boundaries that could destabilize the system. Observation of the heavens remained central. Celestial bodies provided a consistent temporal and ritual framework, guiding human actions in alignment with cosmic order. Stars, planets, and lunar cycles were reference points that ensured stability, linking human practice to patterns that endured despite the absence of direct divine oversight. Political authority evolved into a system of practical stewardship. Kingship depended on the ability to maintain resources, enforce laws, and supervise rituals. Governance became procedural, predictable, and reliable, compensating for the diminished presence of the Anunnaki. Authority was measured by effectiveness in maintaining stability rather than divine favor or charisma. Social structures were designed to reinforce continuity. Legal codes, trade contracts, and civic protocols formed interconnected networks of responsibility, where individual actions affected the balance of the whole. The culture emphasized careful adherence to norms, collective accountability, and precision in every aspect of human activity. Wisdom was understood as the ability to act within constraints, respecting the boundaries of knowledge, power, and cosmic order. Discipline, patience, and attention to detail were valued above ambition or creativity, reflecting a society in which the survival of civilization depended on meticulous care and conscientious action. Ultimately, the Sumerians left a legacy of conscious stewardship. Even as the Anunnaki receded into legend, humans maintained the structures, texts, and rituals that ensured the continuity of order. Their civilization demonstrates that survival and coherence can depend not on divine intervention but on human diligence, precision, and the disciplined preservation of the frameworks that sustain existence. The story of the Sumerians is, therefore, not merely a record of the past, but a testament to the enduring power of careful, deliberate, and conscious action, a civilization that learned to sustain the world itself through attention, ritual, and the preservation of order, leaving a legacy that echoes across millennia.